The cell is smaller than a parking space. Concrete on all sides, steel door, no switch for the light. The bulb stays on, always humming, always white. Every half hour a beam cuts through the slot.
Death row in America. The corridor that doesn't move. Death row in the United States is not a single place. It is a system spread across dozens of prisons, governed by state law, federal policy, and decades of legal precedent. Yet no matter the state, the architecture is the same in purpose: separation. From general population. From time. From the future. In most American prisons, death row is physically isolated, often a building within a prison, or a tier sealed behind multiple locked gates. Inmates sentenced to death do not move freely. Movement is scheduled, controlled, and minimal. Some leave their cells only a few hours per week. Others even less. The sentence is not just death. It is waiting. How death row is structured. Death row inmates are typically housed in single-occupancy cells. This is not for comfort. It is for control. The cells are usually smaller than general population units, designed to limit movement and interaction. Across states, conditions vary, but common elements remain. Solid steel doors or barred fronts. Narrow windows or none at all. Constant artificial lighting in some facilities. Meals passed through slots. Recreation alone, in caged yards. Unlike general population inmates, death row prisoners are often excluded from prison work programs, group education, vocational training, congregate religious services. This isolation is not accidental. Administrators argue it reduces violence, escape risk, and legal complications. Critics argue it is prolonged solitary confinement under another name. The longest wait. Contrary to public perception, execution rarely comes quickly. In the United States, the average time spent on death row exceeds 15 years. Many inmates remain for 20, 25, even 30 years. Some die of illness or age before their sentence is carried out. Others have their sentences overturned after decades. This delay is not mercy. It is bureaucracy. Appeals are mandatory in capital cases. Every death sentence triggers automatic state appeals, post-conviction review, federal habeas corpus petitions. Each step can take years. Prosecutors defend the process as necessary to ensure accuracy. Defense attorneys argue the delay itself becomes punishment. For inmates, time stops meaning anything measurable. Days are counted. Years blur. Life on a tier meant for dying. Death row units are quiet in ways that general population blocks are not. There is less shouting. Fewer fights. Not because inmates are calmer, but because they are alone. Communication happens through walls, vents, or during brief recreation periods when cages are adjacent. In some prisons, inmates develop entire relationships without ever seeing each other's faces clearly. Guards rotate frequently. Assignments to death row are often short-term. Many officers request transfers. Others stay and detach emotionally. No one calls death row a place of rehabilitation. The state does not expect transformation. It expects compliance. Mental decline is not an exception. Psychologists who have studied death row consistently report high rates of depression, anxiety disorders, post-traumatic stress symptoms, psychosis. The combination of isolation, uncertainty, and the knowledge of a scheduled death creates what some experts call death row phenomenon. While courts have debated whether this constitutes cruel punishment, the U.S. Supreme Court has never ruled death row confinement itself unconstitutional. The system continues. The execution date. When an execution date is finally set, nothing dramatic happens at first. The inmate is informed, usually weeks or months in advance. Legal teams scramble to file last-minute appeals. Media requests increase. Victims' families are notified. Inside the prison, procedures activate. Security protocols tighten. Movement restrictions increase. The inmate may be transferred closer to the execution chamber. Some states move prisoners to a special holding cell, often called a death watch cell, closer to the execution room. From that moment, the countdown becomes official. The staff who carry it out. Executions are not handled by a single executioner. They involve wardens, medical staff, correctional officers, legal observers. Most staff are trained to treat executions as procedural events. Many refuse to discuss them afterward. Some leave the profession entirely. Contrary to popular belief, many officers assigned to executions report long-term psychological impact, not from violence, but from repetition and responsibility. The system requires participation. Refusal often means reassignment or resignation. Religion, ritual, and final requests. U.S. law allows condemned inmates limited final accommodations. A spiritual advisor, within rules. A final meal, restrictions vary by state. Final statements, spoken or written. These moments are tightly controlled. Nothing is spontaneous. Everything is logged. Some inmates speak to victims' families. Some apologize. Others remain silent. Some use the moment to protest innocence. The prison records it all. What death row really is. Death row is not chaos. It is order taken to its extreme. It is a place where time stretches without meaning. Human contact is rationed. The future is legally defined. Executions are rare compared to the number of people waiting. Yet the threat is constant. Every inmate knows the machinery exists, and that it may eventually reach them. The punishment is not just death. It is living with the certainty of it. Appeals, errors, and the question of innocence. Death row in the United States exists because the legal system claims certainty. The sentence of death is supposed to be reserved for the worst of the worst, cases where guilt is unquestionable and punishment is final. Yet the structure of the appeals process tells a different story. It is long, layered, and built on the assumption that mistakes are not only possible, but expected. That is why death row exists as a waiting place rather than an execution line. Why appeals are automatic. In ordinary criminal cases, defendants must request an appeal. In capital cases, appeals are automatic. This is not generosity. It is necessity. Once a death sentence is handed down, the case immediately enters a multi-stage review process. Direct appeal at the state level. State post-conviction review. Federal habeas corpus review. Additional discretionary appeals. Each stage examines different questions. Not whether the crime was horrific, but whether the law was followed exactly. A death sentence can be overturned for reasons that seem technical to the public. Improper jury instructions. Prosecutorial misconduct. Ineffective assistance of counsel. Withheld evidence. Faulty forensic testimony. These are not loopholes. They are structural failures. The reality of trial quality. Capital trials are expensive. They require expert witnesses, forensic analysis, and extended jury selection. Yet many defendants facing the death penalty are represented by underfunded public defenders. In multiple states, investigations have shown that defense attorneys failed to investigate alibi evidence. Mental illness histories were not presented. Mitigating factors were ignored. Attorneys lacked experience in capital litigation. The quality of legal representation often depends more on geography than guilt. In rural counties, prosecutors are more likely to seek the death penalty. Budgets are smaller. Defense resources are thinner. The outcome is not uniform justice, it is location-based risk. Wrongful convictions on death row. Since the modern death penalty era began in 1976, over 190 death row inmates have been exonerated in the United States. These are not sentence reductions. These are cases where convictions were overturned entirely. Exonerations have occurred because of DNA testing, recanted witness testimony, discovery of suppressed evidence, confessions by the actual perpetrators. In some cases, inmates spent decades on death row before release. Some were freed days or weeks before scheduled execution. The system did not catch the error quickly. It caught it late, or almost too late. Forensic evidence, trusted, then discredited. For decades, courts treated certain forensic techniques as near infallible. Hair comparison, bite mark analysis, tool mark matching. Many of these methods were later found to lack scientific validity. Yet they had already helped secure death sentences. In multiple overturned cases, expert witnesses testified with absolute certainty about evidence that modern science now considers unreliable. The legal system moved faster than the science, and people paid the price. Confessions under pressure. Not all death row inmates were convicted through physical evidence. Some were convicted primarily on confessions. False confessions occur more often than the public believes, particularly when suspects are young, mentally impaired, exhausted or intimidated, interrogated for extended periods. Once a confession exists, it dominates the case. Jurors trust it. Judges allow it. Appeals struggle to undo it. Even when DNA later contradicts the confession, the process to reverse a death sentence can take years. Race, geography, and the death sentence. Statistical patterns in capital punishment are impossible to ignore. Studies consistently show defendants accused of killing white victims are more likely to receive death sentences. Black defendants are disproportionately represented on death row. A small number of counties produce a large percentage of death sentences. The death penalty is not applied evenly across the country. Two identical crimes can result in different outcomes based solely on jurisdiction. Justice, in practice, is not blind. It is local. Life during the appeals process. While lawyers argue in courts hundreds of miles away, inmates remain locked in their cells. Appeals do not change daily life on death row. Conditions remain the same. Isolation. Restricted movement. Limited human contact. Many inmates develop an awareness of the legal system far beyond that of ordinary prisoners. They learn case law. They track decisions. They wait for mail like it's oxygen. A denial letter can arrive years after a filing, often without explanation beyond legal language. Hope exists, but it is fragile. The psychological weight of uncertainty. Unlike life sentences, death row sentences carry an unresolved ending. The inmate does not know if they will die in prison naturally, be executed, or be released. This uncertainty has a measurable psychological effect. Chronic anxiety. Hypervigilance. Emotional numbness. Some inmates stop pursuing appeals out of exhaustion. Others continue filing even when the odds approach zero. The legal system allows inmates to waive appeals, but courts scrutinize such decisions heavily, aware that despair can mimic consent. Victims' families and the waiting game. Appeals affect more than inmates. Families of victims are drawn into a cycle of anticipation and delay. Execution dates are set, stayed, rescheduled, and cancelled. Closure becomes conditional. Some families support appeals, believing accuracy matters more than speed. Others see delays as a failure of justice. The system offers no resolution that satisfies everyone. When the system admits error, an overturned death sentence does not always mean freedom. In many cases, The sentence is reduced to life without parole. A retrial is ordered. Charges are modified. Exoneration is rare compared to sentence reduction. Yet every overturned case proves one fact beyond dispute. The death penalty operates in a system that makes mistakes. And mistakes are irreversible once carried out. The core question. The appeals process is often criticized as slow and inefficient. But it exists because the alternative is unacceptable. Without appeals, innocent people would be executed. Misconduct would remain hidden. Faulty science would go unchallenged. The system delays death not out of mercy, but out of fear of error. And that fear is justified. The execution process. Executions in the United States are not spontaneous acts of punishment. They are administrative procedures governed by written protocols, legal checklists, and institutional routines. Every step is planned in advance, documented, and reviewed. The process is designed not for spectacle, but for control, legality, and finality. By the time an execution is carried out, the case is no longer about guilt or innocence. It is about whether the state has the authority to end a life, and whether all legal obstacles have been cleared. Setting the execution date. An execution cannot occur without a warrant or order issued by a court or governor, depending on the state. Once all mandatory appeals are exhausted, prosecutors request an execution date. Judges review the procedural history to confirm that no appeals are pending. When a date is set, it is not guaranteed. It is conditional. Defense attorneys often file last-minute motions citing newly discovered evidence, mental competency concerns, changes in execution protocols, constitutional challenges. Many execution dates are postponed hours or days before the scheduled time. Some are halted minutes before. Others proceed as planned. Pre-execution confinement. Once an execution date is active, the inmate's status changes. In most states, the prisoner is transferred to a death watch cell, located near the execution chamber. This cell is under constant observation. Officers log movements, behavior, and interactions around the clock. The purpose is not only security. It is prevention. Suicide prior to execution is considered a failure of the system. Movement becomes minimal. Showers are supervised. Meals are monitored. Legal visits are scheduled precisely. The inmate is no longer part of the broader death row population. They are isolated for the final phase. Witness selection. Executions in the United States are not private. Witnesses typically include representatives of the victim's family, media members, legal officials, prison administrators. The condemned inmate may also request witnesses, usually family members or spiritual advisors, subject to approval. Witnesses are briefed beforehand. They are instructed on where to stand, what they may observe, and what they may not do. Photography and recording are prohibited. The goal is transparency without disruption. Methods of execution. The method of execution depends on state law. Over time, methods have changed due to legal challenges and public scrutiny. Commonly authorized methods have included lethal injection, electrocution, gas inhalation, firing squad. Today, lethal injection is the primary method used in the United States, though alternatives remain authorized in some states if lethal injection is unavailable or challenged. Lethal injection protocols. Lethal injection protocols vary by state, but generally involve a sequence of drugs administered intravenously. States have modified protocols repeatedly due to legal challenges and drug availability issues. Some states use a single drug protocol, a multi-drug sequence. Medical professionals are often involved, but participation is controversial. Many medical associations prohibit members from actively participating in executions, leading states to rely on anonymous or non-medical personnel. The drugs are prepared in advance. Dosages are specified in written protocols. Everything is timed. The role of medical staff. Medical staff do not declare death out of discretion. They follow defined criteria. Absence of pulse. Lack of respiration. Non-responsiveness. In some states, a physician must be present. In others, trained medical technicians fulfill the role. The involvement of healthcare professionals has been repeatedly challenged in court on ethical grounds. Despite these challenges, the process continues under state authority. Final statements. Most states allow the inmate to make a final statement. This is optional. Final statements vary widely. Apologies to victims' families. Assertions of innocence. Religious declarations. Silence. The statement is recorded verbatim by prison staff. Media witnesses may later report it, but the state does not editorialize. There is no requirement to express remorse. There is no script. The moment of execution. The execution itself is controlled and quiet. Witnesses observe from behind glass. Prison staff operate equipment from adjacent rooms. Commands are given according to protocol. There is no announcement of suffering. There is no commentary. When the process is complete, a designated official checks for signs of life. Death is pronounced. The time is recorded. The execution chamber is then secured. After death. Once death is pronounced. Witnesses are escorted out. The body is released according to prior arrangements. Documentation is completed. The inmate's remains are either released to family, buried by the state. The prison returns to routine operations. Staff rotate off assignment. The chamber is cleaned. The institution moves on. Staff impact and institutional silence. Correctional officers assigned to executions often receive limited psychological support. Some report long-term effects. Sleep disturbances. Emotional detachment. Increased stress. Others compartmentalize the experience as part of their duty. Discussion of executions among staff is discouraged. Silence is the norm. The system does not dwell on what has occurred. It records it and proceeds. Public awareness versus reality. Public debates often focus on whether executions are humane or inhumane. Inside the prison, the question is narrower, whether procedures were followed. Executions are not chaotic. They are not emotional events within the institution. They are administrative endpoints. The finality lies not in the act itself, but in the absence of reversal. What execution represents? Execution is the visible end of a long legal process. It is the only part the public sees clearly. Everything before it, appeals, isolation, delay, remains largely invisible. The state does not frame execution as revenge. It frames it as law enforcement carried to conclusion. Whether that conclusion is justified remains the central question. Decline, abolition, and the future of capital punishment. Death row in the United States was once expanding. During the 1980s and 1990s, executions increased, death sentences were common, and public support for capital punishment was high. Today, that momentum is gone. Death row still exists, but it is shrinking, aging, and increasingly isolated within the American justice system. The death penalty has not disappeared, but it is no longer advancing. The numbers tell the story. At its peak in the late 1990s, more than 3,500 inmates were held on death row across the United States. Since then, the population has steadily declined. Several factors drive this: fewer death sentences handed down each year, increased sentence reversals, legislative abolition in multiple states, prosecutorial reluctance to seek capital punishment. Executions still occur, but far less frequently than in previous decades. Some states have death rows but have not carried out executions in years or decades. The system exists, but it is slowing. States that walked away over time, a growing number of states have abolished the death penalty entirely, either through legislation or court rulings. Others retain it in law but no longer use it in practice. Reasons cited by lawmakers include risk of executing the innocent, high financial cost of capital cases, lack of deterrent effect, moral and ethical concerns. In states that abolished capital punishment, existing death sentences were often commuted to life without parole. Death row units were closed or repurposed. Abolition did not lead to chaos. It led to administrative restructuring. The cost argument: one of the strongest forces against the death penalty is not moral, it is financial. Capital cases cost significantly more than non-capital murder cases due to lengthy trials, expert witnesses, mandatory appeals, extended incarceration. Studies in multiple states have shown that life without parole is far cheaper than pursuing execution. Even supporters of the death penalty have questioned whether the expense is justified. In budget-driven political environments, cost matters. An aging death row population. As executions slow, death row populations age. Many inmates sentenced in the 1980s and 1990s are now elderly. Some suffer from chronic illness, cognitive decline, or mental impairment. Courts increasingly face questions about whether executing elderly or mentally deteriorated inmates serves any purpose. Some inmates die of natural causes before their appeals conclude. Death row, in many cases, has become a place where people wait to die, regardless of execution. Mental competency and legal limits. U.S. law prohibits executing inmates who are mentally incompetent, defined as lacking an understanding of their punishment or the reason for it. This has led to complex legal disputes when inmates develop dementia, severe mental illness, brain damage. Courts must decide whether treatment to restore competency is ethical when the sole purpose is execution. These cases further delay executions and expose ethical contradictions within the system. Public opinion has shifted. Public support for the death penalty has declined significantly over the past 30 years. Factors influencing this shift include DNA exonerations, media coverage of wrongful convictions, greater awareness of racial disparities, high-profile execution failures. Support still exists, particularly following violent crimes, but it is no longer dominant. Younger generations, in particular, are less supportive than previous ones. The death penalty is no longer politically untouchable. Victims' families are not unified. There is no single victim's perspective on capital punishment. Some families support the death penalty and view execution as justice fulfilled. Others oppose it, citing prolonged legal battles and emotional exhaustion. For many families, the appeals process becomes a second trauma, forcing them to relive the crime repeatedly without resolution. Life without parole offers certainty. Death row offers delay. International isolation. The United States is increasingly isolated among developed nations in retaining the death penalty. Most Western democracies have abolished capital punishment entirely. Some international courts and human rights organizations openly criticize its continued use in the U.S. While international opinion does not dictate U.S. law, it influences diplomatic relationships and global perception. The death penalty has become an American outlier. The future of death row is unlikely to disappear overnight. But its trajectory is clear. Possible futures include continued decline in death sentences, more states abolishing capital punishment, death rows becoming symbolic rather than active, executions becoming rarer and legally riskier. Some states may retain the death penalty in law while effectively abandoning it in practice. Others may end it entirely. What death row ultimately represents? Death row was built on certainty, the idea that some crimes demand death, and that the system could deliver it accurately. What time has revealed is uncertainty. Uncertainty in convictions, uncertainty in fairness, uncertainty in morality, uncertainty in outcome. The system has not collapsed. It has slowed under its own weight. The final reality: death row in America is no longer a conveyor belt. It is a holding pattern. It holds People sentenced decades ago, legal contradictions, moral disputes the country has not resolved, executions still happen. But they happen inside a system increasingly aware of its limits. Whether death row will fully disappear is unknown. What is known is this: the era of expansion is over. The era of doubt has already arrived.